The title of this presentation is When the Israelites Worshipped Other Gods. The article that I'll be examining today is The Appearance of Pantheon in Judah by L.K. Handy in The Triumph of Elohim. Here it is on the screen if you would like to check it out. The title of my first slide is The Anachronistic Picture of Orthodoxy. Let's first define some terms. Orthodoxy is essentially the right way of doing something, while heterodoxy is a deviation from orthodoxy. Here Handy is saying that the biblical authors viewed the heterodox way of worship to be the worship of a pantheon of deities rather than Yahweh alone. However, as Handy notes, these authors have a theological axe to grind, and this seems to be a retrojection of post-exilic theology into the past, which is therefore why I labeled this picture of orthodoxy anachronistic. In truth, as Handy notes, it is unlikely anyone worshipping the deities in these pantheons would have thought they were doing anything wrong. This segues into my next point. As already noted, the average Israelite/Judahite likely didn't view what they were doing as wrong. Handy summarizes this point well when he says, it can safely be said that they were not simply perversely and intentionally evil in their own eyes, but that they had a theology for the pantheon in which they believed that satisfactorily explained the cosmos to them and fulfilled their basic religious needs. Essentially, they were just living life. Handy now tries to reconstruct the Judahite pantheon. In doing so, he tells a story, a real story, not a fictitious one, of how Smith had written an article, Mark S. Smith, by the way, just in case you aren't familiar with him. He had written an article titled Divine Travel as a Token of Divine Rank, in which he recovers a four-tiered pantheon from Ugarit. Handy had also independently, which I find very impressive, reconstructed a four-tiered pantheon as well through anthropological and sociological arguments in his dissertation, A Realignment in Heaven, an investigation into the ideology of the Josianic Reform. Handy believes that the pantheon in Judah had a similar four-tiered structure, which is something we will now get into. So, I'll give a quick rundown of the tiers that they had reconstructed in the Ugaritic pantheon. The first tier housed the high gods, El and Asherah. The second tiers housed the active deities. These would be deities such as Baal, Anat, Atar, etc. The third tier housed craft deities. An example of a craft deity would be the deity Kothar Wahasis, who builds weapons for Baal in the Baal cycle. The last tier would include the messenger deities. For those familiar with any Hebrew, it should be apparent who these deities will be parallel to in the Bible. Okay, to give a quick rundown of the biblical tiers of pantheon, you have Yahweh and Asherah on the top. You have Baal, I'll alternate between Baal and Baal. Mot, Shemesh, Yareah, and the sons of God. Tier 3 you have Nehushtan, and in tier 4 you have angels. Note that in tier 2, those are just like generalized deities. I'm sure there were more, but these are the ones that Handy focused on in his paper. And I know some of you may be thinking, the biblical authors rejected Asherah worship. I will come back to that later. Trust me. It's really important. So, remember when I said it was really important? This is what I was talking about. These are some important points to keep in mind going forward when thinking of the second and third tiers of deity, and the first one when including Asherah. So, the deities in these tiers are not acknowledged by the biblical authors, apart from polemics and the denigration of the Israelite/Judahite populace. However, the fact that these deities were worshipped by the Judean populace means that, as Handy notes, they did indeed exist as deities in the religious realm. We also can note that they were established in the official religion as priests, prophets, and rulers were condemned for preferring these deities to or worshipping them alongside Yahweh. Therefore, regardless of whether or not the biblical authors endorsed or acknowledged these deities as legitimate, it is still important to count them in the tiers of the Judahite pantheon, as these deities were worshipped by the Judahite populace and their rulers. Whether or not this is heterodox or orthodox, is completely irrelevant to the conversation. Keep that in mind. Very important. Okay, with that being said, let's move on to these tiers. So, the second tier, Shemesh and Yarea. So, Baal should be self-explanatory. You know, he has this whole thing in the Bible. Again, if you're even watching this, you should already know. Baal was worshipped by Israelites and Judahites. Shemesh and Yarea, however, are both mentioned in the book of Jasher that is quoted in the book of Joshua. The quote goes, Shemesh, in Gibeon, do not move. In Yarea, in the valley of Ajalon, calling on these deities to stand still in the sky so that Joshua could have a longer battle time to kill people, essentially. In Ezekiel 8, the cult of the sun goddess, the sun god / goddess, finds representation in the Jerusalemite temple. Therefore, this was like not just something that blew over quickly. This was established, and these deities are commonly found in the second tier in the West Semitic world. Okay, on to the second half of the second tier. You have Mot and the sons of God. So in Hosea 13:4, there appears to be a reference to the deity Mot, from which Yahweh could save one, which is very impressive, giving Mot's representation in the Baal cycle. I meant to say reputation, but representation also works, so whatever. And in Jeremiah 19:20, Mot is pretty anthropomorphic in seeking out people to slay. In Psalm 82, there are rebellious deities who are condemned for their misbehavior. These gods must answer to the highest authority in the pantheon, just as they had to Anu-Gareb. And in Genesis 6:4, we see the sons of God seemingly doing an action they are not supposed to do, mating with the daughters of man, producing the Nephilim. And so the sons of God in this passage are often conflated with angels. This, however, is not a conflation that had taken place until after the tiers of Pantheon had collapsed, and as Handy will later note, the texts of the Bible that have been used to demonstrate a notion of fallen angels are confusing these messenger deities with the other tiers of the Pantheon. He likely had Genesis 6:4 in mind when writing that. And so, I think ending this section on the second tier with Handy's quote is pretty good close. If the Psalms derive from the cult, the Judahite cult, then they provide clear evidence of a cult with a hierarchically structured pantheon, in which the deities are capable of misbehavior and the loss of their ruling positions at the discretion of their superiors. That is to say, they are gods of the second level. There is only one third-tier deity that can be identified within the pantheon of Judah. The god is Nehushtan. This isn't the actual name of the deity, but rather a pun on what the deity specializes in, which is snake bites. The name Nehushtan was given to the deity by Hezekiah. This character has a number of parallels to the Ugaritic goddess Shatakatu, and needs to be understood as the same type of deity, highly specialized, created by the highest authority of the divine realms, and for a particular emergency as a healing deity. This character was revealed in the Judahite cult, where sacrifices were made to it until, for unknown reasons, Hezekiah removed the Nehushtan from the official pantheon. And the last tier of the Israelite pantheon are the messenger deities, aka the angels. These low-level deities have no volition and they just take orders from above, but the angels in the Bible were sent on multiple errands in addition to simply being messengers. The notion of fallen angels is a relatively late notion, post-exilic, that likely would have been absurd to the Judean populace. The texts of the Bible that have been used to demonstrate a notion of fallen angels are confusing these messenger deities with the other tiers of the pantheon. And an example of that would be Genesis 6:4, as I gave earlier. Now some may be wondering, what about Lucifer? Hold on, that's a whole nother article, whole nother topic. Fun topic, but a whole nother one. Okay, closing remarks. So, as Handy notes here, after the exile, the pantheon had collapsed, and was reduced to the levels of Yahweh only and the divine messengers, whatever their divinity may entail. This, as he notes, leaves only one power actively running the universe, that is, Yahweh. Now, I may be wrong here, but when Handy says, chances for variance with the desires of the proper rule of the universe, as embodied in the notion of the will of Yahweh, disappear, he seems to be referring to the variance of things that could happen now that the other gods have disappeared from the pantheon. Summarizing what I just said, there is no more variance because these gods are no longer in the pantheon. This, I think, is best exemplified by what is said in Isaiah 45:7, where Yahweh says, I form light and create darkness. I make will and create woe. I, the Lord, do all these things. There are no longer any deities or cosmic forces that have a hand in what goes on in the cosmos. As Handy previously noted, this belief, the pantheon, would explain a universe seemingly at odds with itself, and the occurrence of events clearly at odds with the theology of the devotee of any single divinity. However, with the collapse of the pantheon, this goes away, and as Handy says, an entire complicated theology disappears from the cult of Judea. So, these are my thoughts on the article. Overall, I think the article is pretty good, but I do have a few, thoughts to share. I struggle with finding the line between this is an actual deity and this is a personification of an older Canaanite concept that has been somewhat demythologized. But that is a shortcoming on my part, not Handy, who has done far more research in that area. I still, however, would have liked more explanations on how we can know that they were the former and not the latter. I do, however, find Handy's reconstruction of the Judahite pantheon quite convincing and will take that framework into account in future discussion of pre-exilic Israelite/Judahite religion. I also love how he humanizes the Israelite populace who are far too often demonized for deviating from orthodoxy. I would, however, like to see more evidence that the view of the later authors is anachronistic and a retrojection into the past. I find this idea interesting, but it is far too big of a claim to make and simply leave at that. He does, however, have a lengthy footnote that I can comb through for references, so again, a shortcoming on my part and not his.